The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as 8-year-old Sophie Martinez sat on the cold concrete, swinging her legs back and forth. Her worn sneakers barely touched the ground from the tall step, and she clutched her favorite teddy bear tighter with each passing minute. The bear's fur had long since faded from its original brown to a pale tan, and one of its button eyes hung loose from a single thread Sophie's dark eyes kept, dotting between the courthouse doors and the parking lot where expensive trucks and cars gleamed in the sunlight. She had been waiting for over an hour, but her mama had told her to stay put no matter what. Elena Martinez worked inside the courthouse as a cleaner, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans from dawn until dusk. It wasn't glamorous work, but it put food on their small table and kept the lights on in their tiny apartment. The little girl's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that breakfast had been nothing more than a stale piece of bread with a thin layer of peanut butter. Mama had said there wasn't enough for both of them to eat a full meal, so Sophie had insisted she wasn't hungry. At 8 years old, she had already learned that sometimes little lies were necessary to make Mama feel better. Shiny black pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, its chrome bumper catching the sunlight like a mirror. Sophie watched as a tall man stepped out, his boots clicking against the pavement with each step. He wore a crisp white shirt, dark jeans, and a cowboy hat that looked like it cost more than Sophie's family spent on groceries in a month. Everything about him screamed money, from his silver belt buckle to the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. This was Jake Whitmore. Though Sophie didn't know his name yet, she only knew what her mama had whispered to her earlier that morning while pointing through the courthouse window. "See that man there, Mia? He owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties. People like him, they have power, they have money. They can make things happen that people like us can only dream about." Sophie had pressed her small face against the glass, watching as Jake had spoken with other men in expensive suits. She noticed how they listened when he talked, how they nodded and shook his hand with respect. Even the lawyers seemed to treat him differently than they treated people like her mama. Now, as Jake walked toward the courthouse entrance, Sophie felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She had been building up courage for this moment all morning, rehearsing the words in her head over and over again. But seeing him up close, seeing how tall and important he looked, made her feel smaller than ever. Jake was thinking about the property dispute that had brought him to town. A neighboring ranch owner was claiming that Jake's cattle had damaged his fencing, and now they were headed to court over it. It was a minor issue, really, but one that required his attention. He had built his success on handling every detail. Personally, no matter how small. As he approached the courthouse steps, Jake noticed the small girl sitting alone. She looked out of place among the formal atmosphere of the legal building, like a wildflower growing through a crack in concrete. Her clothes were clean but obviously secondhand, and she held on to that teddy bear like it was her most precious possession. Something about her reminded him of his own childhood, back when his family had struggled to make ends meet before his father's ranch finally became profitable. Sophie took a deep breath and stood up as Jake reached the bottom step. Her legs felt wobbly, like they might give out at any moment, but she forced herself to move. This was her chance, maybe her only chance, and she couldn't waste it. "Mister," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake paused and looked down at her. Up close, she seemed even smaller, and he could see that her dark eyes were red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "Yes, sweetheart?" The kindness in his voice gave Sophie the courage she needed. She stepped closer, still clutching her teddy bear, and looked up at him with all the desperation an 8-year-old could muster. "Please protect my mama, mister," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush. "She's all I have left in this whole world, and I'm scared something bad is going to happen to her." Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. He had been expecting to be asked for directions or maybe some spare change, not this. The raw honesty in the little girl's voice hit him like a punch to the gut. He crouched down to her level, his expensive suit forgotten, as his knees touched the dusty ground. "What's your name, honey?" he asked gently. "Sophie," she replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Sophie Martinez. My mama works inside." Cleaning. She told me to wait out here, but I saw you and I thought maybe. Her voice trailed off, and Jake could see the uncertainty creeping into her expression. She was beginning to realize how crazy this must sound to him, a stranger she had just approached on the courthouse steps. Maybe what, Sophie? Jake encouraged, his voice soft and patient. Maybe you could help us, she finished, her words barely audible. There's this bad man, and he's been coming around our house. He scares Mama real bad, and she cries when she thinks I'm not looking. She tries to hide it, but I can hear her sometimes at night. Jake's jaw tightened as he began to understand what Sophie was telling him. He had seen enough of the world to know that a frightened woman and her child usually meant trouble of the worst kind. This bad man, Jake said carefully, does he hurt you or your mama? Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded bravely. He used to be Mama's boyfriend, but then he went to jail. Now he's back, and he says mean things to her. He says she's gonna pay for what she did to him. I don't understand what Mama did wrong, but she's scared all the time now. The courthouse doors opened, and Elena Martinez stepped out into the sunlight. She was a small woman, probably in her late 20s, with the same dark eyes as her daughter. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the uniform of the courthouse cleaning staff. When she saw Sophie talking to the well-dressed stranger, her face went pale with worry. "Sophie!" Elena called out, hurrying down the steps. "Mia, what are you doing?" Sophie turned toward her mother, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Mama, I asked him to help us. I asked him to protect you from Rico." Elena's face flushed with embarrassment as she reached them. She looked at Jake with apologetic eyes, clearly mortified by her daughter's boldness. "I'm so sorry, sir," Elena said, her accent thick with nervousness. "Sophie, you can't bother people like this. Come on, we need to go." But Jake held up a gentle hand, stopping Elena from pulling Sophie away. "Ma'am, your daughter wasn't bothering me. She was being very brave." Elena looked at him suspiciously, unsure whether to trust this stranger who seemed too good to be true. In her experience, rich men didn't usually care about the problems of working-class women and their children. "My name is Jake Whitmore," he said, extending his hand to Elena. "And I think we need to talk?" The fear in Elena's eyes was unmistakable now, the same fear that Jake had seen in Sophie's voice. Whatever was happening in their lives, it was serious enough to make a desperate 8-year-old approach a complete stranger for help. Sophie looked between her mother and Jake, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, this tall man with the kind eyes might be the answer to her prayers. All she wanted was for her mama to be safe, for them to not have to look over their shoulders every time. They walked home from the store. As the three of them stood there on the courthouse steps, none of them knew that this moment would change all their lives forever. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with the simplest words, and sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is ask for help, when the adults in their world seem powerless to protect themselves. Jake Whitmore had made a lot of decisions in his 42 years. But offering his ranch as shelter to a stranger and her child wasn't one he had planned on making that Tuesday morning. Yet here he was, 3 hours after meeting Sophie on the courthouse steps, sitting across from Elena Martinez in a small diner on the edge of town, watching her stir her coffee for the 10th time without taking a sip. "You don't even know us," Elena said quietly, her eyes fixed on the swirling cream in her cup. "Why would you want to help?" Sophie sat beside her mother, coloring on the back of a paper placemat with crayons the waitress had brought over. She was drawing a house with a big yard, and Jake noticed she had added several horses to the picture. Every few minutes she would glance up at him with hopeful eyes before returning to her artwork. Jake leaned back in the worn vinyl booth, his cowboy hat resting on the table beside his untouched burger. "Sometimes you just know when something's right," he said. "Your daughter had the courage to ask for help when she needed it. That tells me a lot about the kind of people you are." Elena finally looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. She had learned the hard way that men who seemed too good to be true usually were. Rico had been charming too at first. He had promised to take care of her and Sophie, to be the father figure Sophie needed after her real daddy died in Afghanistan. But promises, Elena had learned, were just words that disappeared when things got difficult. "I can't pay you," Elena said bluntly. "I make barely enough to cover our rent and food. I can't afford to owe someone like you." "I'm not asking for money," Jake replied, "but I am asking for something." Elena's shoulders tensed, and Jake could see the defensive walls going up in her eyes. Sophie stopped coloring and looked between the two adults, sensing the change in her mother's mood. "I'm asking for you to let me help," Jake continued gently. "No strings attached. No expectations. Just one person helping another because it's the right thing to do." The diner bell chimed as new customers entered, and Elena instinctively turned to check who it was. Her whole body relaxed when she saw it was just an elderly couple, but Jake didn't miss the fear that had flashed across her face. This woman was living in constant terror, always looking over her shoulder, always expecting the worst. "Tell me about Rico," Jake said, keeping his voice low so Sophie wouldn't hear clearly over the diner's background noise. Elena's hands began to shake slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "He was my boyfriend for about 8 months. 2 years ago. At first he seemed wonderful. He brought Sophie little gifts, took us out to dinner, made me feel like maybe we could be a real family again." She paused, glancing at Sophie, who was now drawing what looked like a dog next to the horses. "But then he started getting angry about little things. If dinner wasn't ready when he got home, if Sophie was too loud while watching TV, if I talked to other men at work, the anger got worse and worse until—" Elena's voice trailed off as she touched her left shoulder unconsciously. Jake noticed the gesture and felt his jaw clench. He had seen enough of life to know what that touch meant. "You pressed charges?" Jake said. It wasn't a question, Elena nodded. "The neighbors called the police one night when they heard Sophie screaming. Rico had pushed me down the stairs and I had to go to the hospital. Sophie was so scared, she wouldn't stop crying for hours. That's when I knew I had to do something. Not just for me, but for her." Sophie looked up from her drawing. "Is that when the bad man went away, Mama?" "Yes, Mia," Elena said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "But now he's back and he's angry. But I told the police what he did." Jake studied Sophie's innocent face and felt something shift inside his chest. This little girl had already seen too much, experienced too much fear for someone her age. She should be worried about homework and cartoons, not whether some man was going to hurt her mother. "Has he contacted you since he got out?" Jake asked. Elena's laugh was bitter. "Contacted me? He shows up everywhere. At the grocery store, outside Sophie's school, at our apartment building. He doesn't threaten me directly because that would violate his parole, but he makes sure I see him. Make sure I know he's watching." The waitress came by to refill their coffee cups, and Elena waited until she was gone before continuing. "Last week, he left a note under my car windshield. It just said, 'Soon.' That's all. Just that one word, but I knew what it meant." Jake felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "What did the police say when you reported it?" "They said unless he actually threatens me or violates the restraining order, there's nothing they can do. Following someone isn't illegal as long as he stays the required distance away." Elena's voice cracked slightly. "But he knows the system. He knows exactly how far he can push without getting in trouble." Sophie finished her drawing and turned the placemat around so Jake could see it properly. "This is your ranch," she announced. Proudly, "Mama told me you have lots of horses and cows and a big house." Jake smiled at the drawing, noting how she had made the house look warm and welcoming, with smoke coming from the chimney and flowers in the yard. "It's beautiful, Sophie." "You're a real artist. Can I really see your horses?" Sophie asked her, eyes bright with excitement. "I've never seen a real horse up close before." Elena's face flushed. "Sophie, we haven't decided anything yet. Mr. Whitmore might change his mind." "I won't change my mind," Jake said firmly. "The offer stands. My ranch is about 20 minutes outside of town, and I have a guest house that's been sitting empty for 2 years. It's got 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and its own private entrance. You and Sophie would be completely safe there." Elena bit her lip, torn between pride and desperation. "I need to work. I can't just hide away and expect you to support us. I'm not asking you to hide away, Jake said. I'm asking you to be smart about your safety while we figure out a permanent solution. And as for work, I could use someone to help with the ranch's bookkeeping and correspondence. I've been handling it myself, but I'm better with cattle than I am with paperwork. This wasn't entirely true. Jake was perfectly capable of managing his own books, but he could see that Elena needed to feel useful, needed to contribute something in return for his help. He understood pride, having grown up in a family that had struggled to accept charity even when they desperately needed it. Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve. Please, Mama? I want to see the horses, and maybe the bad man won't find us there. Elena looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at Jake's patient expression. Every instinct told her this was too good to be true, that accepting help from a wealthy stranger would somehow make things worse. But another part of her, the part that was tired of being afraid, tired of jumping at every shadow, whispered that maybe this was the break they needed. If I said yes, Elena said slowly, it would just be temporary, just until I can figure out something else. Jake nodded. Whatever you're comfortable with. And I would pay rent, even if it's just a little bit. We can work something out. Elena took a deep breath and looked at Sophie's eager face one more time. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, we'll try it. Sophie let out a small cheer and immediately started asking questions about the horses. But Elena's mind was already racing ahead to all the things that could go wrong. She had learned not to trust easily, not to believe in fairy tale endings. But sometimes she thought as she watched Jake patiently answer her daughter's endless questions about ranch life. Sometimes you had to take a leap of faith. What Elena didn't know was that Rico Vasquez had been watching the diner from across the street for the past hour, taking pictures with his phone and writing down the license plate number of Jake's expensive truck. The game, as far as Rico was concerned, was just getting started. The first week at Jake's ranch had been like a dream for Sophie. She woke up every morning to the sound of horses whinnying in the distance instead of car horns and sirens. The guest house was bigger than their old apartment, with windows that looked out over rolling green pastures instead of a parking lot full of broken cars. But best of all, her mama was starting to smile again, really smile. Not the fake one she used to put on when she thought Sophie wasn't looking. Miguel Santos had been working on Jake's ranch for 15 years, and he had never seen his boss bring strangers home before. The older man had weathered hands and kind eyes, and he spoke to Sophie in a mix of English and Spanish that reminded her of her grandmother, who had passed away when she was little. Miguel had grandchildren of his own in Mexico, and he seemed to understand exactly what Sophie needed without her having to ask. Mia, you want to help me feed the horses this morning? Miguel asked as Sophie sat on the porch steps of the guest house. Still in her pajamas and clutching her teddy bear, Sophie's eyes lit up. Really? Mama said I shouldn't bother anyone. You're not bothering anyone? Miguel said with a gentle smile. Besides, the horses have been asking about you. They want to know when that little girl with a brave heart is going to come visit them properly. Elena appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day. She had been up since 5 in the morning, organizing files in Jake's home office. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that cleaning courthouse floors never had. Jake had been right about needing help with his paperwork. The man could run a 1,000-head cattle operation, but his filing system was a disaster. Are you sure it's okay, Miguel? Elena asked, worry creeping into her voice. I don't want Sophie getting in the way. She won't be in the way. Jake's voice came from behind Miguel. He was walking up from the barn, his clothes already dusty from the morning's work. In fact, I was hoping Sophie might want to meet Lightning today. Sophie jumped up from the steps. Lightning? Is that a horse's name? Jake nodded. She's a young mare, about 3 years old. She's been lonely lately, and I think she could use a friend. For the past week, Jake had been watching Sophie from a distance, noting how she always seemed drawn to the horses, but never quite worked up the courage to get close. He remembered being her age and feeling the same mixture of fascination and fear around the large animals. His father had taught him that horses could sense a person's heart, And Jake had a feeling that Lightning and Sophie would understand each other. As they walked toward the barn, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it casually, then stopped walking so suddenly that Sophie bumped into her. "Mama, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, looking up at her mother's pale face. Elena's hands were shaking as she stared at the phone screen. Jake immediately moved to her side, positioning himself between her and the main road that led to the ranch. "What is it?" Jake asked. Quietly, Elena showed him the phone. The message was from an unknown number, but they all knew who had sent it. It was a photo of Sophie feeding chickens the day before, taken from somewhere near the ranch's front gate. Below the photo was a single line of text. "Nice place. Lots of room to hide, but not forever." Jake's jaw tightened as he looked at the photo. Rico had been watching them, had been close enough to take pictures, and none of them had even known. The ranch suddenly felt less like a safe haven and more like a trap. "Miguel, take Sophie to see Lightning," Jake said, his voice carefully controlled. "Elena and I need to talk." Sophie looked between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding it. "Is the bad man coming here?" she asked in a small voice. Elena knelt down to her daughter's level, forcing a smile onto her face. "No. Mia, Mr. Jake is just being extra careful to keep us safe. You go with Miguel and make friends with Lightning, okay?" Sophie nodded reluctantly and took Miguel's offered hand. As they walked toward the barn, Jake could hear Miguel distracting her with stories about when Lightning was born during a thunderstorm, which was how she got her name. "How did he get my number?" Elena asked once Sophie was out of earshot. "I changed it after he got out of prison." Jake was already pulling out his own phone. "That's not important right now. What's important is that he's been here on my property watching you and Sophie. That changes everything." Elena hugged herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning. "Son, maybe we should leave. I don't want to bring this trouble to your home." "You're not bringing trouble anywhere," Jake said firmly. "This man is the trouble, and running away won't solve anything. He'll just follow you wherever you go." Jake dialed a number and waited for someone to answer. "Tony, it's Jake Whitmore. I need to hire some security for my ranch, starting today. Professional level, not just someone to watch the gate." Elena listened as Jake arranged for armed security guards to patrol the ranch 24 hours a day. The cost he was agreeing to would have covered her rent for 6 months, but he didn't even hesitate. When he hung up, Elena shook her head. "I can't let you do this. This is too much money, too much trouble, all for people you barely know." "Stop," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just stop. You and Sophie aren't just people I barely know anymore. You're living in my guest house. Sophie is learning to ride my horses, and you're organizing my entire business. You're part of this place now, part of my life, and I protect what's mine." The way he said, "what's mine," made Elena's heart skip a beat. She had been so focused on keeping herself and Sophie safe that she hadn't noticed the way Jake looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, or how he always seemed to find excuses to check on them throughout the day. "Jake," she started, but he held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it's too much, that you don't deserve this kind of help, that you should handle your own problems. But here's the thing, Elena, for the first time in 5 years, I wake up in the morning and hear laughter coming from somewhere on this ranch. Sophie's laughter, your laughter. This place was like a tomb before you got here." Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't understand. Everyone who tries to help me gets hurt. That's what Rico does. He finds ways to hurt people who care about me." "Let him try," Jake said, and there was something in his voice that made Elena believe he meant it. "This isn't some courthouse with overworked security guards. This is my ranch, my land, and I know every inch of it. More importantly, I know people who can help us end this the right way." From the barn, they could hear Sophie's delighted laughter as Lightning apparently decided to be friendly. Miguel's voice carried on the wind, teaching her the proper way to hold an apple so the horse could take it gently. "What do you mean, the right way?" Elena asked as Jake looked toward the barn where Sophie was experiencing pure joy for the first time in months. "I mean, we stop running and start fighting back. Not with violence, but with the law. Real law, not the local police who are too busy or too understaffed to help. I have connections, Elena. People who owe me favors. People who can make sure Rico goes back to prison and stays there this time. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this nightmare could really be over, but she had been disappointed too many times before. And if your plan doesn't work? She asked. Jake met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Then we'll figure out another plan. And another one after that, if necessary. The one thing that's not going to happen is you and Sophie getting hurt on my watch. A car engine sounded in the distance, coming up the long driveway to the ranch. Both Elena and Jake tensed until they saw it was a security company vehicle. The guards Jake had called were already arriving, less than an hour after his phone call. As they watched the security team set up their equipment and establish patrol routes, Elena realized that her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. A week ago, she had been a scared single mother with nowhere to turn. Now she was standing next to a man who was willing to turn his peaceful ranch into a fortress, just to keep her and her daughter safe. The question was whether even Jake's determination and resources would be enough to stop Rico before he found a way to make good on his threats. Because Elena knew Rico better than anyone, and she knew that he was just getting started. 2 weeks had passed since the security team arrived at Jake's ranch, and life had settled into a careful routine. Sophie went to school in town with one of the guards driving her, while Elena worked alongside Jake managing the ranch's business affairs. The guest house had started to feel like home, and Sophie had begun calling Lightning her horse, even though Jake was the one who officially owned her. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Rico's behavior didn't match what he knew about typical domestic violence cases. The man was too organized, too patient, too careful about staying just within the legal boundaries. Most abusers acted on emotion and made mistakes that got them arrested. Rico seemed to be playing a much longer game. Late one evening, Jake sat in his home office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. His computer screen glowed in the darkness as he scrolled through page after page of information about Rico Vasquez. What he found made his blood run cold. Rico wasn't just Elena's abusive ex-boyfriend. He was connected to a network of people involved in moving illegal substances through their county. The prison records showed that Rico had been cellmates with known dealers, and his arrest record went back much further than Elena knew. The domestic violence charge that had sent him to prison was actually the least serious crime on his record. Jake printed out several documents and walked to the guest house, where he could see Elena still awake, sitting at the kitchen table grading some of Sophie's homework. She looked up when he knocked and immediately noticed the serious expression on his face. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, letting him inside. "We need to talk," Jake said quietly. "Is Sophie asleep?" Elena nodded toward the bedroom where Sophie was sleeping peacefully, her arm wrapped around her teddy bear. "She's been out for an hour." "Why? What did you find?" Jake spread the printed documents across the kitchen table. "Elena, what exactly did you witness the night Rico was arrested?" Elena frowned, confused by the question. "I told you, he pushed me down the stairs." The neighbors heard Sophie screaming and called the police. "No, I mean before that. Earlier that day, or maybe the day before, did you see Rico with other people? Did you overhear any conversations that seemed strange?" Elena sat down heavily, her mind racing back to that terrible time. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with anything?" Jake pointed to one of the documents. "Rico wasn't just arrested for hurting you. He was under investigation for drug trafficking. The detectives' notes say they believed he was using your relationship as cover for his real activities." Elena's face went pale as memories started flooding back. "There were people coming to the apartment sometimes. Men I didn't recognize. Rico would send me and Sophie to the store or to the park when they came over. He said it was business meetings that would be boring for us. What else do you remember?" Jake asked gently. Elena pressed her hands to her temples, trying to think clearly. "The night before he was arrested, I came home early from work because I was feeling sick. Rico was in the kitchen with two men I'd never seen before. They had bags on the counter and they were counting money. Lots of money. Jake felt his stomach drop. Did they see you? Rico noticed me first. He was angry that I was home early, but he tried to play it off like it was a normal business meeting. He introduced me to the men, but I could tell they weren't happy about meeting me. One of them kept staring at me like he was trying to memorize my face. Elena, Jake said carefully, I don't think Rico is after you because of your relationship. I think he's after you because you're a witness to something that could send him and his friends to prison for a very long time. Elena stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. That's impossible. I didn't see anything important. I don't know anything about drugs or money or whatever you think this is about. You saw faces. You saw them with money and bags that were probably full of illegal substances. You could identify them in court if you were ever asked to testify. Elena turned back to face him, her eyes wide with fear. But I would never testify about that. I don't want anything to do with those people. They don't know that, Jake said. All they know is that you're out there and you saw something you shouldn't have seen. As long as you're alive, you're a threat to their operation. The weight of Jake's words settled over Elena like a heavy blanket. This wasn't about Rico wanting revenge for their failed relationship. This was about much more dangerous people wanting to eliminate a potential witness. Oh my God, Elena whispered. Sophie, if something happens to me, what happens to Sophie? Jake stood up and walked over to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Nothing is going to happen to you. But now that we know what we're really dealing with, we can fight back properly. Elena looked up at him with tears in her eyes. How? How do we fight people like that? With the truth, Jake said. And with help from people who are trained to handle situations like this. Jake had been thinking about this possibility for days, and he had already made some phone calls to people he trusted. His lawyer had connections with federal investigators who specialized in drug trafficking cases. If Elena was willing to cooperate, they might be able to use her testimony to bring down the entire network. What would I have to do? Elena asked. You'd have to tell the federal agents everything you remember about that night. They'd probably want you to look at photos, see if you can identify the men you saw. And eventually you might have to testify in court. Elena sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jake was suggesting. I'm not brave enough for that. I'm not like Sophie, asking strangers for help. I'm just a woman who cleans floors and tries to keep her daughter safe. Jake knelt down beside her chair so they were at eye level. Elena, you are one of the bravest people I've ever met. You left an abusive relationship to protect your daughter. You pressed charges even though you knew it would make Rico angry. You accepted help from a stranger because you knew Sophie needed to be safe. You're already braver than you know. Elena looked toward Sophie's bedroom, where her daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the danger swirling around them. What if they come after Sophie to get to me? They won't get the chance, Jake said firmly. I've already talked to the federal agents. If you agree to cooperate, they'll put you and Sophie in protective custody until the case is resolved. Real protection, not just security guards at the ranch. Elena had never imagined that her quiet life could become so complicated. A year ago, her biggest worry was whether she could afford Sophie's school supplies. Now she was being asked to help bring down criminals who could make her disappear if they wanted to. I need time to think, Elena said. Of course, Jake replied. But Elena, you should know that whether you cooperate or not, these people already see you as a threat. The only way to really be safe is to make sure they can't hurt you anymore. As Jake walked back to his house, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the documents he had left behind. In the bedroom, Sophie stirred in her sleep and called out for her mama. Elena went to check on her, smoothing her daughter's hair and pulling the blanket up to her chin. Sophie's eyes fluttered open. Mama, is everything okay? Everything's fine, Mia, Elena whispered. Go back to sleep. But as Elena watched her daughter drift back to sleep, she knew that nothing was fine. Nothing had been fine for a long time, and it wouldn't be fine until she found the courage to face the truth about what she had witnessed that night. The question was whether she was brave enough to risk everything to protect the daughter who meant more to her than her own life. 3 days after Jake revealed the truth about Rico's criminal connections, Elena made the hardest decision of her life. She agreed to cooperate with the federal agents, but only on one condition. Sophie would be kept completely safe, no matter what happened to her. The meeting with the federal agents took place in Jake's living room on a quiet Thursday morning. Agent Rodriguez was a woman about Elena's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Agent Chin was older, with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent years convincing frightened witnesses to trust the system. Sophie was at school, accompanied by 2 security guards who looked like regular ranch workers. She had no idea that her mother was about to make a choice that would change their lives forever. "Elena, we want you to understand that what you're doing takes real courage," Agent Rodriguez said, spreading photos across Jake's coffee table. "These men have been operating in this area for over 2 years, and you're the first witness we've found who can place them together with evidence of their crimes." Elena's hands shook as she looked at the photographs. Even after all this time, she recognized the faces immediately. The men who had been in her kitchen that night, counting money and handling mysterious bags, stared back at her from the pictures. "That's him," Elena said, pointing to a photo of a man with a scar across his left cheek. "He was the one who kept staring at me like he wanted to remember what I looked like." Agent Ching made notes while Elena identified 2 more men from the photos. With her testimony, they would have enough evidence to arrest the entire network. "Not just Rico? What happens next?" Jake asked from his position beside Elena on the couch. "We move fast," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Once we make the arrests, Elena and Sophie will need to be relocated until the trial. It could be several months before it's safe for them to return to a normal life." Elena felt her heart sink. "Relocated? You mean we have to leave here?" "It's temporary," Agent Chin assured her. "But yes, you'll need to live somewhere else under new identities until these men are convicted and sentenced." Elena looked around Jake's comfortable living room, thinking about the guest house that had become home, about Lightning waiting in the barn for Sophie's daily visit, about Miguel who had become like a grandfather to her daughter. For the first time in years, they had found a place where they belonged. "How long?" Elena asked quietly. 6 months. Maybe less if the case moves quickly through the courts, Agent Rodriguez said. "We know it's not easy, but it's the only way to guarantee your safety." Jake reached over and took Elena's hand. "Whatever you need, wherever you go, I'll be here when you get back." Elena squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. In the past month, Jake had become more than just their protector. He had become the family she and Sophie had never had. The stability she had always dreamed of providing for her daughter. That evening, as Elena tucked Sophie into bed, she tried to find the words to explain that their life was about to change again. "Mama, why do you look sad?" Sophie asked, hugging her teddy bear tighter. "I'm not sad, Mia. I'm just thinking about some things." Sophie sat up in bed, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. "Is the bad man coming back?" Elena smoothed her daughter's hair, marveling at how perceptive 8-year-old children could be. "The bad man won't be able to hurt us anymore, but we might have to go away for a little while." "Away from here? Away from Lightning and Miguel and Jake?" "Just for a little while," Elena repeated, her voice barely steady. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she asked the question that broke Elena's heart. "Did I do something wrong when I asked Jake for help?" "Oh, baby, no," Elena said, pulling Sophie into her arms. "Asking Jake for help was the bravest, smartest thing anyone has ever done. You saved us, Sophie. You saved our whole family." The next morning brought chaos that none of them had expected. Elena woke up to the sound of car engines and shouting voices. Through the guest house window, she could see federal agents swarming the property. Not to arrest anyone, but to provide protection for what was about to happen. Agent Rodriguez knocked on the door, her face grim. "Elena, we need to move up our timeline. Rico and his associates are planning something for today. We're making the arrests now, but we need to get you and Sophie to safety immediately." Elena's mind raced as she threw clothes into bags for herself and Sophie. This was really happening. After months of fear and uncertainty, it was all coming to an end. But not in the gradual way she had imagined. Jake appeared at the guest house door, his face tight with worry. The agents want you to pack only what you absolutely need. They're moving you within the hour. Sophie emerged from her bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. What's happening? Why is everyone here? Elena knelt down to her daughter's level. Remember how I told you we might have to go away for a little while? Well, it's time to go now. But I didn't get to say goodbye to Lightning, Sophie said. Tears starting to form in her eyes, Jake crouched down beside Elena. Sophie, I promise you that Lightning will be here waiting for you when you come back. And Miguel will take extra good care of her while you're gone. Promise? Sophie asked. I promise, Jake said solemnly. And I'll take pictures of her every day and send them to your mama so you can see how she's doing. As Elena finished packing, Agent Chun provided details about their new temporary life. They would be living in a small town 3 states away, with new names and a carefully constructed background story. Elena would work in a local library and Sophie would attend elementary school under her new identity. The hardest part, Agent Chun warned, is that you won't be able to contact anyone from your old life until the trial is over. No phone calls, no letters, no social media. Complete radio silence. Elena understood the necessity, but it didn't make the prospect any less heartbreaking. She had finally found a place where she and Sophie belonged, only to have to leave it behind. The car that would take them to their new life was waiting in the driveway. Miguel stood nearby, his weathered hands holding Lightning's lead rope. The horse seemed to sense that something important was happening, and she kept looking toward the guest house as if waiting for Sophie to appear. Sophie ran to Miguel first, throwing her arms around his waist. Take care of Lightning for me, okay? Of course, Mia, Miguel said, his voice thick with emotion. And you take care of your mama. Then Sophie turned to Jake, who had been standing quietly to the side, letting her say her goodbyes. She looked up at him with the same brave expression she had worn that first day on the courthouse steps. Thank you for protecting my mama, she said simply. Jake knelt down and pulled her into a hug. Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help. Elena watched this exchange with tears streaming down her face. 6 months ago, she had been a terrified woman with nowhere to turn. Now she was about to testify against dangerous criminals, secure in the knowledge that no matter what happened, her daughter would always remember that there were good people in the world willing to help when help was needed. As their car pulled away from the ranch, Elena looked back to see Jake standing in the driveway, Lightning beside him, both of them, watching until the car disappeared over the hill. 6 months later, Elena and Sophie returned to find the ranch exactly as they had left it, except for one addition. A small sign hung on Lightning's stall that read Sophie's horse, and the Mare whinnied excitedly when she heard familiar voices approaching. Rico and his associates were serving lengthy prison sentences, and Elena was free to live her life without fear for the first time in years. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most unexpected help comes from the most unexpected places, and that courage, once found, never really goes away. As Sophie ran to reunite with Lightning, Elena stood beside Jake and realized that some families aren't born, they're chosen, and sometimes they begin with a little girl brave enough to ask a stranger for help.